When a mighty army surrounded her city and hope was gone, one woman dared to believe in something greater. She had no sword, no army, only faith, beauty, and a bold plan. This is the story of Judith, the fearless widow who changed the course of a nation. It began with a war of giants. In the 12th year of his reign, Nebuchadnezzar, the ruthless king of the Assyrians, ruled the great city of Nineveh with an iron fist. Far from him, beyond the mountains, another mighty ruler, Arphaxad of the Medes, fortified his city of Ecbatana with stones so massive they seemed like mountains stacked by the gods themselves. Towering gates, impenetrable walls, and skyscraping watchtowers made Ecbatana look invincible. But pride has a way of painting a target on kingdoms. Nebuchadnezzar looked eastward with burning ambition. The plain near Ragai was soon flooded with the war cries of a massive alliance. Assyrians, Chaldeans, men from the rivers Euphrates and Tigris, warriors of Arioch, and countless more. They marched like a thunderstorm toward Arphaxad, but Nebuchadnezzar's hunger for power was not satisfied. He sent messengers westward, demanding allegiance from Persia to Egypt, from Lebanon to Jerusalem. His command was simple: join him or face his wrath. But what he received was not obedience, it was silence. Kingdom after kingdom turned their backs. They scoffed at the self-declared Lord of all the earth. His messengers returned empty-handed, humiliated. And Nebuchadnezzar lost his mind. He swore, not by gods or stars, but by his own throne, that he would crush them all. The lands of Moab, Ammon, Judea, even mighty Egypt would paint them red with revenge. 5 years passed. Then, in the 17th year of his reign, Nebuchadnezzar unleashed fury. The battle drums echoed across the earth. He marched against Arphaxad, crushed his army, and chased him into the mountains. The once mighty king of Ecbatana was skewered with spears, his towers fallen, his city reduced to ash. Nebuchadnezzar had tasted blood, and it made him drunk with power. Victorious, he returned to Nineveh, surrounded by warriors and slaves, and for 120 days, the palace roared with music, feasting, and laughter. But the laughter was hollow. It was the laughter of a madman preparing for a greater terror. For the West had not yet felt his sword. Chapter 2, Holofernes, the Sword of Vengeance. And then, he summoned his monster. It was the 22nd day of the first month in Nebuchadnezzar's 18th year, when whispers filled his palace, whispers of vengeance. He called his nobles, generals, and advisors. No more begging for loyalty. No more waiting. He decreed a brutal mission: destroy every nation that dared defy me. Then, like a beast awakened, he summoned Holofernes, chief general, second only to the king, a man with no heart, only orders. Nebuchadnezzar's voice thundered, take 120 of my fiercest warriors, 12,000 horsemen. Bring the earth and sky to their knees. Let rivers flow with blood. If they yield, chain them. If they resist, burn them. Holofernes bowed, and so began a campaign the world would never forget. Within days, the army was in formation. Camels, donkeys, and wagons loaded with provisions. Gold and silver piled high like hills. Soldiers marched in endless lines, like locusts darkening the horizon. Their destination? Every land that disobeyed the great king. They stormed westward. First came the fall of Put and Lud slaughtered. Then Rasis and the land of Ishmael pillaged. Through Mesopotamia they marched, leaving cities in smoke. Cilicia fell. Arabia trembled. The tents of Midian were engulfed in flames. Damascus, caught in the wheat harvest, was devoured, fields burned. Cities sacked. Young men hacked down in the dust. By the time Holofernes reached the coast, terror had gone ahead of him like a phantom. From Tyre to Ascalon, people quaked. No army stood. No city dared rise. This wasn't war, it was annihilation. A tidal wave of death led by a man who had no mercy, and a king whose rage was unquenchable. And yet, beyond the fear, beyond the bloodshed. A small, unsuspecting corner of Judea would become the hinge of history. A woman would rise, not a soldier, not a queen but a widow. And her name was Judith. Imagine an army so terrifying that entire nations would rather surrender than resist. One by one, the neighboring lands bowed to Holofernes, brutal general of King Nebuchadnezzar. Messengers came with words wrapped in submission. "We are your servants. Our land, our livestock, even our city is stake them. Do with us as you please." And Holofernes? He didn't blink. He marched to the seacoast, setting up military garrisons and handpicking the strongest men from conquered cities. The people welcomed him with garlands, music, and dancing, but behind their songs was fear, a dreadful, suffocating fear. Yet Holofernes showed no mercy. Even as they welcomed him with praise, he desecrated every sacred place. Temples were torn down, holy trees were cut, statues were smashed. Why? Because he wasn't just here for territory. He was here on a dark mission to erase every god except Nebuchadnezzar. He moved his forces with strategic precision, stopping near the great hills of Judea, between Geba and Scythopolis. And there he camped, resting and replenishing for one purpose: the final strike on Israel. Word traveled fast. When the Israelites heard what had become of the other nations, a cold wave of fear gripped their hearts. They had just rebuilt their sacred temple after years of exile. The altar had barely been rededicated, and now a monster of war was at their gates. Jerusalem trembled. The leaders acted quickly. Messages were sent to cities across Samaria and beyond. Mountain passes were fortified, ramparts were raised, food was stored. The people were preparing not just for battle but for survival. Joachim, the high priest, sent a warning to Bethulia's last line of defense, a small mountain town strategically placed near the plain of Dothan. The message was urgent. Guard the mountain passes. If Holofernes gets through, all of Judea will fall. The people obeyed, but it wasn't swords they reached for. First, it was sackcloth. From the smallest child to the oldest elder, men and women fell on their faces in the dust. Foreigners and slaves joined them. Animals groaned as their owners wept beside them. Ashes stained their clothes and heads. They fasted, they cried, they pleaded. "Lord, don't let our children be taken. Don't let our wives become slaves. Don't let our inheritance be burned to the ground." At the temple, Joachim and the priests offered sacrifices day and night, tears mixing with blood on the altar. The air trembled with the sound of sorrow. But above all the despair, one hope remained. God was listening. And in the shadow of looming destruction, Judith was watching. When Holofernes, the fearsome Assyrian general, heard that the Israelites were not only defiant but had fortified their mountainous region, his rage burned within him. These people had dared to stand against him when the rest of the West had bowed in fear. Summoning the governors and warlords of Moab and the seacoast, Holofernes demanded answers. "Who are these mountain dwellers?" he thundered. "What gives them the courage to resist me?" Then, from the assembly, one voice rose with unexpected wisdom and courage. Achior, leader of the Ammonites. With great respect and clarity, Achior began to tell the story of the Israelites, a people who once lived among the Chaldeans but left everything behind to worship the one true God. They were not just another tribe, they were a chosen people with a divine history and an unshakable faith. Achior continued, recounting how their God had led them from Mesopotamia to Canaan, how famine drove them to Egypt, and how slavery could not destroy them. When they cried out to God, Egypt was struck by plagues, and the Israelites walked through the parted Red Sea. With God on their side, they conquered mighty nations and settled in the land. But Achior warned that their strength was tied to their obedience. Whenever they turned from their God, they were conquered and scattered. Yet now, having returned to their faith, they were once again under divine protection. If they have sinned, Achior concluded, we will defeat them. But if they remain faithful, their God will shield them, and we will fall. His bold words enraged the crowd, who mocked Israel's weakness and promised easy victory. But Achior had spoken the truth, and the truth, though unpopular, stood firm. No earthly army can overcome a people under the protection of Almighty God. History may forget those who rely on swords and chariots, but heaven remembers those who trust in the Lord. After Achior's daring speech, the camp of Holofernes erupted in outrage. The generals and soldiers mocked him, declaring that the Israelites would be like bread for their hungry army. But Holofernes, filled with wrath, responded with deadly arrogance. He scoffed at the God of Israel and exalted Nebuchadnezzar as the only true Lord. "Who is their God, if not my king?" he raged. Promising devastation, he vowed that Israel's mountains would flow with blood. Then, to shame Achior, he ordered that he be bound and handed over to the very Israelites he had defended, so he could perish with them. Holofernes thought he had silenced the voice of truth. But in reality, he had just sent a messenger of hope straight into the heart of God's people. Achior was delivered to the foot of Bethulia, tied and left by the Assyrian guards. The men of Bethulia, vigilant and alert, saw strangers approaching and rushed to defend their town. After recognizing Achior and hearing his story, they untied him and brought him before their leaders. As Achior told of Holofernes' pride and threats, the people were stirred not with fear, but with faith. They bowed before God, crying out for his intervention and justice. That night, while the enemies celebrated, the Israelites fasted, prayed, and sought the face of their deliverer. And Achior, once mocked and cast aside, was welcomed, honored, and nourished in the house of Uzziah. Though the enemy planned destruction, God was preparing a deliverance that would shake the nations. Don't ever underestimate the power of a single voice of truth. God uses what the enemy meant for shame to set the stage for victory. The sun rose on a day that would bring dread to the hearts of the Israelites. Holofernes, the mighty Assyrian general, gave the command to his enormous army to march toward Bethulia. With a thunder of feet and the clatter of chariots, 170,000 foot soldiers and 12,000 cavalry advanced, stretching from Dothan to Belbane, encircling Bethulia like an iron noose. Their purpose was clear-occupy the mountain passes, cut off the water supply, and crush the spirit of God's people. When the Israelites saw this multitude, fear swept over them like a storm. "Surely," they cried, "this host will consume our land and leave nothing behind." Yet in desperation, they lit fires on the towers and stood guard through the night, weapons in hand, praying for deliverance. But Holofernes was cunning. After studying the terrain, he discovered the spring that sustained the city and quickly cut it off. His officers, the leaders of Edom, Moab, and the coastal regions, urged him not to engage in battle, but to let thirst do the work. "Seize their water," they said, "and soon they will beg for mercy." So Holofernes agreed. The siege tightened, and the people of Bethulia felt its grip. Days turned into weeks. 34, in total and despair, took root. The children wept for water, women collapsed in the streets, and the cries of the dying echoed through the town. The people turned in fury against their leaders, accusing Uzziah and the elders of bringing ruin by refusing peace. "Better to live as slaves than die of thirst," they cried. In anguish, they begged for surrender. But Uzziah, torn between duty and desperation, pleaded for 5 more days. "Hold fast," he said. "Perhaps the Lord will have mercy." With heavy hearts, they returned to their posts, but sorrow blanketed the town. Far from the city square, in the quiet chambers of her home, lived a widow named Judith. She was the daughter of Merari, a woman of noble lineage and even nobler faith. Judith had lost her husband Manasseh years before during the barley harvest, yet she had not lost her devotion to God. She lived a life of solitude and prayer, dwelling in a room on her rooftop, clothed in sackcloth, and fasting continually, except on holy days. Though she possessed great wealth, gold, silver, servants, and land, her true treasure was her reverence for the Lord. Judith was renowned not only for her beauty but for her wisdom, and no one could speak a word of reproach against her. When news of the siege and the despair of the people reached her ears, and she heard of Uzziah's vow to surrender the city in 5 days, a holy fire stirred within her. Judith summoned the town's elders, Uzziah, Chabris, And Sharmasand rebuked them with boldness. "You have spoken wrongly before the people and before God," she said. "Who are you to test the Lord and impose a deadline on his mercy?" She reminded them that God's thoughts are far beyond human understanding, and he cannot be coerced like a man. If he chooses to deliver us in 5 days or not at all, it is his will, she said. But let us not provoke him with unbelief. Judith urged the leaders to trust God as their ancestors did Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, all of whom were tested, yet remained faithful. Then, with great conviction, she declared she would act. "Tonight," she said, "my maid and I will leave the city. Do not ask what I will do. But by the time your vow ends, God will have delivered Israel by my hand." The elders listened in awe, recognizing the wisdom and courage God had placed within her. And so, in the midst of a crumbling city, a woman of faith rose not with sword or shield, but with the quiet strength of trust in her God. When darkness closes in and all hope seems lost, God can raise an unlikely hero from the shadows, someone whose faith will outshine the might of armies. Just as Judith stepped forward in obedience, so too can you rise in your own generation. Never underestimate what God can do through a single life wholly surrendered to him. And so, while the men of Bethulia buckle under pressure, and the elders contemplate surrender, a lone widow rises from the ashes of grief. Not with sword or spear, but with a plan born of boldness and a heart set ablaze by heaven itself. They have no idea what she's about to do. Neither do the Assyrians. And when the dust settles, the name Judith will strike fear into the hearts of mighty men. But what exactly is her plan? How does a widow walk straight into the enemy's camp? Would she ever make it out alive? The next chapter isn't just a story. It's a divine reversal. You've seen the prayer. Now, prepare for the strike.